Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Richard Louv. Acclaimed nature journalist Richard Louv is the author of 10 books, including Last Child in the Woods, The Nature Principle, and Vitamin N. Translated into more than 20 languages, his books have helped launch an international movement to connect children, families, and communities to nature. Now Louv redefines the future of human-animal coexistence. His newest book, Our Wild Calling, explores these powerful and mysterious bonds and how they can transform our mental, physical, and spiritual lives, serve as an antidote to the growing epidemic of human loneliness, and help us tap into the empathy required to preserve life on Earth. He is co-founder and chair emeritus of the nonprofit Children and Nature Network, which supports a new nature movement. Louv has written for the New York Times, Outside, Orion, Sierra, and many other publications. He appears regularly on national radio and TV and lectures throughout the world. In 2008, he was awarded the Audubon Medal. You can find more information about everything that he does at richardlouv.com. Richard, such an honor to have you on the show, and this is a subject that is extremely fascinating to me and extremely important. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome.
I am curious, what brought you into this area? I mean, you are putting a lot of energy and information out there to drive people towards nature. I mean, why do you feel this calling yourself?
Well, a couple of reasons. I was a kid once, and I spent much of my boyhood in the woods at the edge of the suburbs of Kansas City, and with my dog. My dog always knew where I was, but my parents did not always know where I was. And I found something bigger than my parents and their problems. And I found something bigger than what I saw on television when I was in those woods. And I would not have been able to articulate it then, I don't think, but I felt it. And I was a newspaper columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune for a long time. And in the 80s, I wrote a book called Childhood's Future. And both for my column and for writing that book, I went all over the country and interviewed about 3,000 parents and teachers and kids. And what I learned was at that point that there were a lot of changes going on. And one of the major ones was parents were puzzled. Why weren't their kids going outside or even wanting to go outside? And one little boy kind of explained it in a classroom one day when I was interviewing a class. He said, I prefer playing indoors because that's where all the electrical outlets are. And that was, of course, before everybody carried a cell phone and a smartphone. So it's become even more technological for kids. So the thought of future generations being disconnected from nature and missing out on the connection that I had and so many people my age had, it just is untenable. I can't imagine that. Actually, I can't because of the research that's been done on the disconnect between children and nature. They're not spending much time outdoors. Even before the pandemic, the last several decades has seen an increasing disconnect between children and the natural world.
Yeah, and I know as a child growing up, I mean, my parents were I was raised by a single mother. I mean, she would need to pretty much fight for me to not be outside. I mean, you wanted to be outside, explore, build forts, and be in nature, and or play with other kids. You know, you're always interacting outside, and coming inside was almost like the punishment. And now it seems like you're saying it's just shifted how children are growing up and how they are perceiving the world and where they're getting their entertainment.
Well, there is good news. There is a movement that has emerged in the last few years to connect kids to nature. And it's now not only in the United States, but in Canada. Brazil just launched 2 years ago, launched a national campaign to get kids outdoors. I've been to Australia, to Europe, and Asian countries as well have moved in this direction. And the reason is that there's a body of scientific evidence now that supports the fact that being outdoors in nature is essential to children's health and well-being. When I wrote Last Child in the Woods, which was published in 2005, I could find about 60 studies on both the deficit that was occurring, but also on the benefits of nature, psychological benefits, physical health benefits, cognitive ability to learn and create. There were about 60 studies that I cited in that book that I felt were reputable enough to cite. Today, there are over 1,000 studies, almost all of them on the benefits of nature for kids' health and for adult health. The movement is being helped along by a nonprofit called the Children and Nature Network. And that's the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods. And if you go there, there's a research site there, a research library that we've assembled. And it has abstracts of over 1,000 studies. And they all point in the same direction, which is this is fundamental to human health and well-being. It's also fundamental to the future of the environment, to the future of this planet, that this reconnection take place.
And why do you feel that we've gone away from that? I mean, obviously we have no more technological gadgets, but is that the only reason you feel, or are there other things?
Yeah, tech is part of it. Obviously, it's we're all using technology these days, digital technology, cell phones and smartphones and computers, and more it permeates every aspect of life, whether we're indoors or outdoors. That's a fact, but I'm very careful to say that I am not anti-tech. Rather, there's a different way to look at this, I think. It is a kind of an equation, which is that the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. We need that for balance. It turns out some of the studies show that the burnout we feel when we've been at the computer too long and we find it very difficult to work, that burnout, the best way to reduce that or reverse that is simply to go outside, preferably in a natural area. And then we can get back to our work at the computer. But that neurologically balances the effect of tech on us. So tech is one of the reasons that this is happening, but often reporters want me to focus only on that and say that video games are the end of the world and all of that. And as I say, I don't go there. Other factors are probably more important. One of them is parental fear of strangers. That has skyrocketed in the last few decades, primarily because of the 24-hour news cycle, in which, at least before the pandemic, you would hear about violent crimes toward children outside the home over and over and over. It turns out there's a relatively few of those violent crimes toward children outside the home every year, with the exceptions of school shootings. The stranger danger is much smaller than people think. But people still feel this, so they're conditioned to feel this because it's repeated so often by my profession of journalism, but also in our entertainment media. So parents are terrified to let their kids go outside. Other factors include bad urban design. Parents get preached at all the time. Get your kid away from the tube, go for a walk. Walk where? In some of these neighborhoods. You'll run into a freeway. Or there's nothing to walk to. If you're lucky, maybe within a quarter mile there's a Starbucks. That's the way that zoning has divided us from nature, from anywhere meaningful to walk to. And so cities and suburbs that are unwalkable are part of the issue too. And there's also the distribution of nature. And in the pandemic, that's one of the things we're finding is that people are realizing just how inequitable the distribution of parks in urban areas is. For example, our hunger for nature has actually gone up substantially during the pandemic in urban areas as well. But it's hard to find a place to go in an inner city neighborhood, for example. So the pandemic has made us more aware of that. And I think there's even more hunger for nature now than there was before the pandemic.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, because there's so much more isolation, there's so much more disconnect because of continual messaging that this is what you need to do to curb this pandemic. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Richard Louv. He's the author of A Last Child in the Woods, The Nature Principle, and also the new book, Wild Calling. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Health Made Radio with your host, Dr. Michael Karlfeldt.
Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Richard Louv. He is the author of the book, Wild Calling. So, one of the issues, we're talking about this pandemic, how it's really creating more of a need to be in nature. And also, you're mentioning as the technology is increasing, that we need to balance that out to prevent burnout. Because I know, staring at screens, having that blue light, which they see is really depleting your dopamine levels in your brain, which puts you in kind of that apathetic, not being able to focus, lack of drive and so forth. So nature, like you mentioned, is a way then to balance that out. So I'm curious, what would be, obviously there's a huge amount of health benefits of nature in itself, but what are some of the ones that you have come across that are really important for people to be aware of?
Well, some of the first work on this was done at the University of Illinois on attention deficit disorder. And it turns out that the symptoms of ADD for some kids, not all, but for some kids, those symptoms can be reduced significantly just by going out into nature. And this research raised the question, is much of what we diagnose or label attention deficit disorder actually something else? Is it being cooped up in a room all day? Is it not experiencing nature? Now, the studies show that actual natural surroundings, it's not just going outside, it's going somewhere that is, that is something identifiable as nature, that is what reduces the symptoms of attention deficit disorder in many kids. That's some of the research. Other research has found that physical exercise, they've measured the amount of benefits from going to a gym, an indoor gym on, say, on the machines indoors and on running on the machines, compared to expending exactly the same amount of energy, but doing it in what's called green exercise, hiking or gardening or one of those. Same amount of energy expended in the gym compared to expended in the natural surrounding, and the benefits are great in both places. Your blood pressure gets better, psychological outlook on life gets better on the treadmill indoors, but it gets even better when you go and do green exercise outdoors. But on and on, cognitive development, kids in the natural setting, most kids tend to learn better when they're outside in a natural setting, not just about nature, not just about science, but about everything. And there is a big growth in the number of nature-based preschools, for example, in the United States, just in the last few years. It's increased at least 500%. And parents are beginning to realize this. We're hoping that schools begin to realize it, public schools begin to realize this, particularly in the pandemic when an outdoor classroom is much more protective against the virus than being in a closed classroom with poor ventilation.
Yeah, so, obviously brain health, it's huge, just being able to, like you're mentioning, ADHD, ADD, and then cardiovascular benefit. But I would assume also, the mental health aspect of it is such a big deal nowadays, with young children are being put on antidepressants and anxiety medications, which I didn't see that growing up at such an alarming rate. And it seems to, it's like an epidemic of young children dealing with emotional health issues. So I would assume that nature would have an impact on that as well.
Well, it does. About 10 years ago, I was asked to give the keynote to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national meeting. There were several thousand pediatricians there and pediatric nurse practitioners and others. And first, I was pretty surprised to be asked to give the plenary keynote to them. I'm not a doctor. I'm a journalist. And also the idea that nature deficit disorder, I'm always careful to say that phrase, and that's what I wrote about in Last Child in the Woods, actually called this nature deficit disorder, that's not a known medical diagnosis. Perhaps it should be, but it's a way to think about this thing that people knew was happening but had no language to describe. So I was surprised to be asked by the American Academy of Pediatrics to talk about nature deficit disorder. I did, and the response was far better than I ever could have imagined. Some pediatricians went back to their offices and started literally prescribing nature. Some psychologists, this isn't only in pediatrics, the field of eco-psychology was already there and was already growing, but now it's growing much more because so many of the things that either psychologists, child psychologists, or pediatricians see in their offices, they don't have a cure for. They don't have a magic pill. Ritalin only goes so far, and I'm not saying kids should not take Ritalin. Some should, if their pediatrician says they should. But this added benefit of nature time, of spending time outdoors in nature, pediatricians are now prescribing that, not only for physical health, but for, as you suggested, for emotional health. One of the things that pediatricians have seen more and more among their patients, their young child patients, is depression. The age of depression has dropped significantly in the last 20 years. And whatever we're doing, it's not working. And that's how they have felt. And now that's why there's greater interest now in prescribing nature and using nature in other ways, in education and even neighborhood and urban designers are now considering what they call biophilic design, which is the use of nature in, say, a workplace, a school, a neighborhood, which actually can increase the health and productivity of the people in those environments.
And so as a pediatrician, and there are prescribing nature, as one of the remedies, what would that prescription look like? I mean, what is an appropriate amount of making sure that your child is out in nature? How much would be appropriate to really make sure that they take advantage of the health impact from it?
Well, first, the prescriptions and how they physically look. Some physicians literally have a pad of paper now that has printed on it vitamin N or Nature RX, and they actually write that prescription. And in Washington, D.C., there's a Dr. Robert Czar who went back and organized the pediatricians in Washington, D.C. to start writing the nature prescriptions, but they went the step beyond that. And they created a database of all the parks and open space in Washington, D.C., so they could not only write the prescription, but could turn to their computer and pull up the closest park to the people in the parents in the office sitting there right in front of the pediatrician and suggest that. Some of the studies that have been done out of those 1,000 studies I mentioned have tried to pin down the right dose of nature. The University of Sheffield in the UK, there are pediatricians, researchers there that have said that 10 minutes in nature, walking through trees or whatever, will have immediate psychological benefits. There are other attempts to do this. I'm always a little skeptical of that because the first question is, what nature? What was the weather like that day? There are so many variables that it's very difficult to pin down an actual dose as we do with pills. What I've come to the conclusion, and I write this in a follow-up book to Last Child in the Woods, which was called Vitamin N. It's a book of 500 things that families and communities can do to get kids outdoors and adults. But the mantra that I repeat often is when it comes to, nature prescriptions, some is better than none and more is better than some. Yeah, I think it's up to every family to figure out how much they need and whether it's accessible or not. And again, this is an equity issue. Some neighborhoods it's just not accessible.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you're out in nature, obviously, don't sit in nature and just stare at your cell phone. I mean, try to explore nature and enjoy it fully the way it was intended to be enjoyed.
Right.
We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Richard Louv. He's the author of Last Child in the Woods, The Nature Principle, Vitamin N, and also his new book, Wild Calling. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Health Made Radio with your host, Dr. Michael Karlfeldt.
Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Richard Louv. So, Richard, I know we've been talking a lot about your prior book, Last Child in the Woods and Nature Principle, Vitamin N. But I'm really curious in regards to your new book, Wild Calling. I mean, why did you name it that, and why did you feel such an urge to write that book?
We go back to the beginning of our discussion in which I spent a lot of time in the woods, and I had a lot of encounters with wild animals, and also had a great dog. Our Wild Calling is not only about wild animals; it's also about our pets. And the research I've mentioned, those over 1,000 studies, almost all of those studies, or most of those studies, focus on green space, on the impact of trees, for instance, on psychological or physical well-being. Very few of them focus on wild animals. There is a body of research, obviously, about how pets affect us. When you have a dog or a cat, it can lower your blood pressure, not only because with a dog you're more likely to go for a walk, because you have to take the dog for a walk, but also just touching a pet and petting a pet can lower your blood pressure and your level of anxiety and we've known that for a long time. The whole area of service animals is based on that, is based on the calming effect and also the use of the animal senses to guide a human being. So quite a bit is known about that, but very little is known about how an encounter with a wild animal affects us. I collected a lot of stories from people, which are retold in this book. People who have had encounters with just a coyote walking through a backyard, or encounters with birds, watching birds. One scientist talked about an encounter he had with an octopus. He was an oceanographer, and how it changed his life. Again and again, these people describe these experiences as life-changing. They can be life-enhancing, but they can also be life-changing. So this is a territory that's not been addressed very much, particularly with wild animals. So I had a great curiosity about that. I've had people tell me a lot of stories, and so I collected more of them. And I think they all illustrate just how fundamental this connection we have to other creatures on Earth is.
Yeah, what I really liked about the book, I thought the stories were fascinating. I mean, the story about the octopus, here he's obviously in a life-threatening situation, and you had to then let go, and then from that, then there's a communication that was established between him and the animal, him and the octopus, and you are giving a lot of examples, like you mentioned throughout the book, how an individual in a life-threatening situation then are able to put themselves in a different space, so to say, where they're able then to connect with the animal and communicate with the animal in a way that is beyond, obviously, verbal and normal physical communication. So, and I know the story about the jaguar, the gentleman out that was his communication with a jaguar out in the jungle, and obviously that is a life-threatening situation, but how that all got changed based upon the conversation he and the jaguar had. So I'm curious, how do you explain that communication that can take place over and above physical words that we're used to use or body movements, so to say?
Well, first I should say that some of the extreme examples in the book are life-threatening, but most of the examples are more everyday and not necessarily life-threatening at all. One thing, though, that these experiences do with many people is it takes us out of our comfort zone. And the research into the feeling of awe, there's been a big increase in interest among researchers in what is that? What is it that happens to human beings when they feel a sense of awe? And that does all kinds of good things for us, by the way, psychologically, but also physically. But one of the two characteristics, one is we step out of our comfort zone, and the other characteristic is that we feel touched in some way that we can't explain. This often happens in nature, this feeling of awe. So just as an example of that, I was on a lake one day in my boat in a lake outside of San Diego, where I live. And on the shore, I could see what I thought were two vultures, turkey vultures, eating a dead fish. And I wanted to look at them closer, so I have a little electric motor, so I eased up closely to those vultures. Got within about 20 feet. Turned out they were not vultures. They were two giant golden eagles. And for the next, what seemed like forever, and there's a reason I say seemed like forever, that I'll get to, the eagles would go down and take a bite of the fish and then come right back up. Their head would come back up, and they would look at me. We never lost eye contact. as that was happening over and over and over. I went back and forth in front of him with the electric motor of the boat. You don't get within 20 feet of golden eagles very often. And during what seemed like forever, I felt something between the eagles and me. I felt something shift. Now, I can't speak for the eagles. They may have just been trying to decide whether I was edible. But I felt this thing, which I had felt before. I felt it when I was a kid, when I would encounter animals. And I went home, and my younger son, Matthew, was home from college that weekend. And I told him about this thing. I said, Matthew, I can't explain this, but I felt something happen there. And I was very moved by it. And I said, Matthew, I have no words to describe this. All I can say is that something changed there. And I was transported in a way. And whoever I say I am, Matthew, I'm actually not. Whoever I really am is whoever I am is who I was in those moments with the eagles. In story after story that people shared with me, all kinds of people, that feeling was described. That sense of deep reality, that sense of being at their core, who they were. There were other things that the stories described that I felt too. When we have an encounter with a wild animal in which we're paying attention, time seems to disappear, or it feels like time bends. Another characteristic is that our sense of spatial sense may shift. You know, if you watch an anthill for a long time, your sense of what's large and what's small changes. So these are altered states. And my editor at Algonquin, the publisher of On Wild Calling, had a hard time with that concept for quite a while. And she was very New York, worked in Manhattan. Then one day on the sidewalk, she on her way to work, encountered a pigeon. And she felt that thing happen. The same thing I felt with the eagles. And she said it made her feel like she'd entered an altered state, like she was on drugs. And I said, you know, Amy, that's exactly what it's like when you're paying attention. And the good thing is it's a lot cheaper than drugs and a lot safer, depending on the animal.
I would have to agree. We're going to take a quick break. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Richard Louv. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Health Made Radio with your host, Dr. Michael Karlfeldt.
3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Richard Louv, and we're discussing his new book, Wild Calling. That's such a powerful experience to be able to connect on such a level. Is there a way, are there certain things an individual can do or to place them in or mental state to put them in to be able to kind of have that communication more easily that you know of?
Yeah, there's a guy named John Young who is a famous teacher of nature connection. He doesn't like to be called a teacher, but he calls himself a mentor, and he takes hundreds of people out into the forest in groups and teaches them bird language. And it turns out that birds are talking to each other and to us indirectly all the time. And he's written a good book about this, What the Robin Knows. And people come back transformed once they begin to understand. And it's not a verbal language. It's not words. It is sounds, but it's sounds as well as behavior, as a type of movement that a bird will make. It's what is communicated to the other animals around them. Squirrels, for instance, will mimic the sound of a bird that is worried about something, feels that there's a cat in the neighborhood or whatever. That sound is shared across species. So he suggests that people create a sit spot, maybe in their backyard, somewhere in the woods, somewhere they go to regularly, and just sit and be quiet and watch and listen. Pretty soon, when I was a kid, I would go to the creek, and I would sit down, and the frogs all disappear, and you sit down, and one at a time the frogs begin to reemerge. They pop to the surface, but you're sitting there and you're quiet, and you can have a sense of empathy then with those frogs. Other animals return. That's a good exercise to do if you want to place yourself in a mindful state of mind in which you're paying full attention to the nature around us. One of the themes of the book, or one of the central themes of our wild calling, is human loneliness. We're particularly feeling this right now during the pandemic. And I was asked by the LA Times to write a piece about this, which I wrote an op-ed that ran about a month ago in the LA Times, about why is it that we are so attracted to animals, that we want animals in our lives right now. The shelters, the animal shelters have emptied out. It's pretty tough to find a pet to adopt right now from the Humane Society or others, because people rush intuitively, they're rushed to get more animals in their lives. I think, the medical community has talked for a long time now, several years, about what is called an epidemic of loneliness. It turns out that human isolation is as deadly to people as smoking or obesity in terms of the diseases that it is associated with, many of the same diseases. And loneliness has been growing. I think that, people give a lot of reasons for that, Facebook, anti-social media, and a lot of reasons are given. But I think perhaps the deepest reason has been missed, and that's species loneliness. Deep down, we are increasingly yearning and lonely for the other species that we share the earth with. We've increasingly withdrawn from them. Other animals had a significant role in people's lives in, a millennia ago, hundreds of years ago, or even in the early part of the 20th century. Animals were all around, and you were aware of them. I think that there is a great conversation going on all around us, all the time, if we pay attention. It's not in verbal language. It is, though, language. And there are people like Pat Hasbach, an eco-psychologist, who have been trying to catalog this. Again, it can be sounds, it can be movements. Many of these sounds and movements and other indications of some kind of communication are shared across species. And we share those too. In our wild calling, I call that the oldest language. If you remember the bar scene in Star Wars, when all of these critters, all these humanoids from all over, not humanoids, but creatures from all over the universe were meeting in the bar and drinking together. And they were all talking in different languages, but somehow they seemed to understand each other. That, to me, is the oldest language. It predates verbal language. And that conversation is going on all around us if we pay attention. During the pandemic, people have begun to, and this is what I wrote about in the LA Times, they've begun to really pay attention to nearby nature to the birds right outside their window, an owl that comes back and stays over time. And their connection with those animals, they're noticing. Not only that, they're noticing more animals that have come into cities. In some senses, this can be an illusion, by the way. More and more animals have already been coming, wild animals have already been coming into cities, but they tend, a diurnal, an animal that makes its living during the day, when they enter a city, they tend to become nocturnal. So we really don't see them. They're around us, but we don't know it. Even mountain lions are coming into some cities. But during the pandemics, people started seeing these animals because human beings had withdrawn inside. And so the animals came out. And they thought they were new arrivals when actually most of them probably were already there. And so we're fascinated by this parallel universe that exists all around us. And I think people are taking great comfort in connecting to the animals in their own yards, the passing coyote, the woodpeckers that make us laugh, but also their pets. Pets are more important than ever right now. And one of the questions is that going to stay with us? Is this yearning, this deep yearning to cure our species' loneliness, is that going to stay with us when the pandemic ends? I think for a lot of people it will. And one of the troubling things is that at the very moment when so many people are realizing how much they need nature, and they're flocking to it when they can get it. Parks are now overcrowded in some areas because people have realized they're so hungry for this. But when the pandemic ends, many of the programs that take people into nature, particularly kids from inner cities, may not have survived the pandemic because of the economics of the pandemic. They're struggling. So it's very important that we support those programs right now rather than later.
Hear about it, then talk about it. This is KIDO Talk Radio, 580 AM Nampa, 107.5 FM Boise, Fox News Now.